Imagine stepping out of a time machine into 1800s New York City. Forget the glittering lights of Times Square. We're diving headfirst into the most dangerous neighborhood in American history, the 5 Points. This wasn't just a place on a map. It was a battleground, a labyrinth of filth, crime, and survival, where life was cheap and a wrong look could be your last. The 5 Points was a swampy, disease-ridden slum built on a filled-in pond in Lower Manhattan. Picture this: ramshackle wooden tenements leaning against each other, so crowded that entire families lived in a single, windowless room. The streets weren't paved. They were a disgusting muck of mud, garbage, animal waste, and sewage. The air itself was thick with the stench of poverty and coal smoke. This was the dark underbelly of the American dream, a place where thousands of immigrants, mostly Irish fleeing the Great Famine, were crammed together with freed African Americans, all scrambling for a foothold in a city that didn't want them. And in this chaotic melting pot, gangs weren't just a problem. They were the law. The police, they barely dared to enter. The real power belonged to brutal street armies, with names that struck terror into the hearts of ordinary people. You had the Dead Rabbits, a notoriously violent Irish gang, whose symbol was a rabbit impaled on a pike. Their sworn enemies were the Bowery Boys, a nativist gang of American-born firefighters and butchers who hated the immigrant newcomers. These weren't petty squabbles. These were full-scale riots involving hundreds, sometimes thousands, of fighters armed with clubs, bricks, paving stones, and knives. The streets would literally run red. Let's talk about some of these infamous figures. The leader of the Bowery Boys was the legendary Bill the Butcher, a man so feared. His real name was William Poole. He was a master brawler and a political enforcer, using his gang's muscle to intimidate voters and control elections. He saw the Irish immigrants as an invasion and made it his personal mission to terrorize them. He was a larger-than-life character, a terrifying symbol of the raw, violent power that ruled the 5 Points. Then you had the Plug Uglies, so named because of their giant plug hats, which they stuffed with wool and leather to protect their heads in a fight. They were known for their signature move. They'd rush an opponent, headbutt them in the chest to knock the wind out of them, and then beat them senseless. Or how about the Roach Guards, who wore a blue stripe on their trousers as a uniform? These gangs weren't just fighting for territory. They were fighting for identity, for respect, and for sheer survival in a world that had cast them aside. Life inside the tenements was just as dangerous as the streets. Buildings like the old brewery were infamous. Originally a brewery, it was converted into a tenement that housed over 1,000 people in squalor. It was said that a murder occurred there every single night for 15 years. There were no windows, no ventilation, no running water. Disease was rampant. Cholera, tuberculosis, and typhus swept through the packed rooms, killing children and adults alike. For many, a quick death in a street brawl was a more merciful end than a slow, agonizing one from disease. How did people even survive? They did whatever they had to. Many men worked grueling, low-wage jobs at the docks, while women and children often worked in sweatshops or scavenged for scraps to sell. But for many, crime was the only viable career path. You had pickpockets, known as dips, who were often children, small and quick enough to vanish into a crowd. There were panel thieves, who operated out of taverns. A man would be lured into a back room by a woman, only for a hidden panel in the wall to slide open, allowing a thief to steal his wallet. Everything was a hustle. Everything was a risk. The saloons and dance halls were the centers of this world, places with names like the Slaughterhouse or Sweeney's Shambles. They were dark, grimy, and always packed. Here, deals were made, fights were started, and gangs recruited new members. For a few pennies, you could get a glass of cheap rot-gut liquor that would make you forget your misery for a few hours. It was an escape, but a dangerous one, as these places were magnets for violence. You might be wondering, where were the authorities in all of this? Well, the early police force was disorganized and often just as corrupt as the criminals they were supposed to be fighting. Gang leaders often had politicians in their pockets. They could deliver votes on election day by force. If necessary, in return, politicians would look the other way. The whole system was rotten from the inside out. It was a perfect storm of poverty, political corruption, and prejudice that allowed the 5 Points to fester. The turning point came slowly. Social reformers like Jacob Riis began to shine a light on these horrific conditions with his groundbreaking photojournalism in his book, How the Other Half Lives. His stark images of starving children and overcrowded tenements shocked the conscience of the nation. People could no longer ignore what was happening in their own backyard. Public outcry led to reforms. The city began to tear down the worst of the slums, including the infamous old brewery. They laid new streets, built parks, and started to create a more professional, organized police force. Slowly but surely, the era of the great fighting gangs of the 5 Points began to fade. The neighborhood itself was eventually demolished and redeveloped, literally buried under the foundations of the modern city. Today, if you walk through that area of Manhattan, you'll see courthouses and government buildings. There's almost no trace of the brutal world that once existed right beneath your feet, but the legacy of the 5 Points lives on. It's a powerful reminder of a crucial, and often brutal, chapter in American history. It tells the story of immigration, of the struggle for survival, and of how a city can be forged in fire and conflict. The gangs of New York were not just mindless thugs, they were a product of their time, a desperate response to a society that offered them nothing. Their story is a dark, violent, and absolutely fascinating piece of the puzzle that is New York City. It shows us that beneath the shiny surface of our modern world, there are always hidden histories, stories of struggle and survival that are worth uncovering. Thanks for joining me on this trip back in time. If you found this dive into the dark past of New York as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories. Let me know in the comments what other historical deep dives you'd like to see next. Until then, stay curious.